Germany, May 1945. The war was over, but the silence that followed was louder than the bombs that had once shaken Berlin. Allied forces had broken through the last Nazi defenses, and the once proud Reich had crumbled into dust and broken dreams. Soldiers lay dead, cities burned, and a new power had taken hold. But amid the rubble, there were women left behind. Not just any women, the wives of the men who led the Third Reich. They had once been dressed in silk and pearls, toasting champagne under the chandeliers of the Reich Chancellery. Now, most of them were hiding in basements, posing as widows of unknown soldiers, burning photographs, tearing up letters, and praying that no one recognized their faces. The world wanted justice, and in their eyes, the women were guilty too. Magda Goebbels had already chosen her and poisoning her 6 children and taking her own life in Hitler's bunker. But others survived, and their stories were not so neat. Take Ilse Hess, for example, the wife of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy Führer. She refused to believe her husband was guilty of anything. Even after he parachuted into Scotland in 1941 and was captured, she defended him as a misunderstood patriot. In the days after the war, Ilse roamed the countryside with her son, searching for food and safety, refusing to admit that the ideology they had lived for had failed. Or Emmy Gring, the glamorous wife of Hermann Gring, who had once hosted lavish parties for Nazi elites. After the war, she was captured by the Americans. Her pearl necklaces were yanked from her neck, her fur coat torn from her shoulders. "Did you enjoy the blood-stained gold?" one soldier asked her. She didn't reply. She sat in silence in her cold cell, refusing to speak, refusing to cry. Her husband had swallowed poison the night before his execution. Emmy was left alone, richer than most, but imprisoned by a name no one would ever forget. Then there was Lena Heydrich, widow of Reinhard Heydrich, one of the cruelest architects of the Holocaust. She moved to a remote village in West Germany, using a false identity at first, then openly defending her husband's legacy in interviews years later. She never apologized, never expressed guilt. He did what he thought was right, she once said, and that statement, more than anything, haunted the families of his victims. Many of the women tried to blend into the background of a new Germany. They sewed clothes, worked on farms, and stood in bread lines like everyone else. But they were not like everyone else. Their hands didn't bleed from labor. Their pain was of a different kind: humiliation, exile, a bitter loneliness. The Allies interrogated some, arrested others, but many walked free. Too many. Rumors spread that some had fled to Argentina. Others changed their faces with surgery and lived under new names in small towns across Europe. But the truth was rarely clean or clear. One woman, married to a top SS officer, was found in a nunnery pretending to be mute. Another was discovered in a Paris brothel, drunk and raving about Hitler's betrayal. The world moved on, but the shadow of the Reich followed them. Some tried to write memoirs to clear their names, others stayed silent till death. Their children grew up with haunted eyes, ashamed of their blood, or worse, proud of it. Justice was never truly served, and history didn't know what to do with the wives of monsters. By late April 1945, Berlin was burning. Soviet forces had closed in on the city, and Adolf Hitler had retreated to the Vorbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Alongside him were some of his closest followers, among them Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, and his wife Magda Goebbels. Magda was not merely the wife of a Nazi leader. She was known as the First Lady of the Third Reich, a title unofficially granted by her public devotion to Hitler and her symbolic presence at Nazi events. Born the 11th of November 1901, she had married Joseph Goebbels on the 19th of December 1931, in a wedding where Hitler himself was the chief witness. Inside the bunker, the Goebbels family had brought their 6 children: Helga B. 1932, Hildegard 1934, Helmut 1935, Holden 1937, Hedwig 1938, and Heidrun 1940. As the reality of Germany's defeat became undeniable, Magda descended into despair. She reportedly saw no future for her children in a world without National Socialism. On the evening of the 1st of May 1945, after Hitler and Eva Braun had committed suicide, on the 30th of April, Magda and Joseph decided to end their family line. The exact time is estimated to be around 1 a.m. With the help of SS Dr. Ludwig Stumpfinger, Magda administered cyanide capsules and possibly morphine to each child while they slept in their shared room in the bunker. Afterward, Magda and Joseph Goebbels walked up to the garden behind the Reich Chancellery ruins. There they either took cyanide or Joseph shot his wife and then himself. Historical sources differ. Their bodies were partially burned, as Hitler's had been, though not completely, due to lack of fuel and urgency. The Soviet troops discovered the children's bodies later. They lay peacefully in white nightgowns, bearing no visible wounds, a haunting testament to their mother's deadly conviction. Magda's act was viewed by many historians as a terrifying example of fanatical loyalty. She reportedly said, "The world that comes after Hitler and National Socialism is not worth living in." Some Nazi officials had pleaded with her to escape, with the children offering passage out of Berlin. She refused. To this day, Magda Goebbels remains one of the most chilling figures of the Third Reich, not because of direct crimes she committed, But because of her symbolic devotion and the horrific murder of her children, Ilse Hess stood by the cracked window pane of a cold farmhouse in Bavaria, staring blankly at the fields beyond. It was 1947. Her husband, Rudolf Hess, had been imprisoned in England since his bizarre solo flight to Scotland. In May 1941, an attempt to negotiate peace with Britain that Hitler never sanctioned. Ilse hadn't seen him in years, yet she still wore her wedding ring, still signed her name with pride, Ilse Hess, loyal wife of a patriot. Born Ilse Prohol in 1900, she had met Rudolf Hess in Munich during the early days of the Nazi Party, shared his devotion to the Völkisch movement, anti-Semitism and Hitler's vision. Their marriage in 1927 was a political union as much as a romantic one. Ilse adored Hitler and often boasted of his visits to their home. When Hess flew to Scotland, abandoning his official post without warning, it wasn't just the Nazi regime that shattered Ilse's identity as his loyal partner fell into crisis in the years after the war ended. Ilse refused to accept that her husband had been labeled a war criminal. She called his flight a mission of peace and portrayed him as a martyr betrayed by both the Allies and Hitler. She wrote dozens of letters to Allied officials demanding his release and began campaigning in German newspapers. Despite the ban on Nazi propaganda, Ilse's only son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, just a child during the war, became her partner in this crusade. Together, they collected legal documents, statements, and affidavits to prove Rudolf Hess's mental stability and peaceful intentions. Ilse was relentless. She didn't hide in shame like other Nazi wives. Instead, she fought to clear her husband's name even as the world recoiled at the horrors of Auschwitz and Dachau. But her campaign made her an outcast. In a Germany trying to rebuild under Allied supervision, Ilse's refusal to renounce Nazism was dangerous. She was placed under observation, her home searched multiple times. Local authorities monitored her mail. Still, she remained defiant. "I am proud of what my husband stood for," she once said in an interview, "and no court can change that." The Nuremberg trial sentenced Rudolf Hess to life imprisonment in October 1946. He was transferred to Spandau prison in Berlin, where Ilse was only allowed occasional visits. Their reunions were cold and brief, supervised by guards, with no privacy. Rudolf was a shell of the man she once knew, paranoid, withdrawn, deeply unstable. But Ilse refused to believe he was mentally ill. "They want to break him," she said bitterly, "but they will not break me." As years passed, Ilse became more isolated. Her name was accursed in post-war Germany. Neighbors avoided her. Schools whispered about her son. Some former Nazi families reached out, but even they found her too radical. She published essays defending Hitler, attacked the legitimacy of the war crimes trials, and denied German guilt. Her worldview was frozen in 1939. By the 1960s, Ilse was a widow in all but name. Rudolf Hess remained behind bars in Spandau, lone prisoner after others were released or died. She campaigned until her death, believing he would one day walk free. Ilse Hess died in 1995, 50 years after the Reich she served had fallen into ruins. Her legacy was one of cold loyalty, a refusal to reflect, to question, or to grieve for anyone but her husband. She lived as a symbol of unwavering belief in a cause the world had condemned, and yet, to the end, she never admitted guilt. Not for the millions lost, not even for the pain she passed down to her son. Her story is not of redemption nor is of fanaticism wearing pearls, of a woman who stood at the edge of a broken empire and refused to step away. Emmy Gring had once been the dazzling queen of Nazi Germany's high society. As a wife of Hermann Gring, second only to Hitler for much of the Third Reich, she lived a life of absurd opulence amid a nation at war. But in May 1945, all of that vanished overnight. She was no longer Emmy Gring, the woman who hosted banquets at Cairn Hall and appeared at state parades. She was simply prisoner number 344 at an Allied detention center, born Emma Sandman in 1893. Emmy was a former actress who married Hermann Gring in 1935, in a wedding officiated by Adolf Hitler himself. Their only child, Edda, was born in 1938. Hitler adored Emmy, calling her the First Lady of the Reich since he refused to marry. With her elegant demeanor and theatrical charm, she played the part well. But it was all a facade. When the Third Reich collapsed, Emmy's world crumbled. She was arrested by American troops at the family's estate in Obersalzberg. Her mansion, filled with stolen art and luxury goods looted from occupied Europe, was stripped clean. Soldiers ransacked wardrobes, seized jewelry, and photographed the sheer decadence she had lived in while German cities lay in ruins, and millions starved. During her interrogation, Emmy claimed she was just a housewife, unaware of her husband's crimes, but her stories didn't add up. She had dined with generals who gave orders for mass executions. She had laughed at private receptions where Hitler outlined his plans for conquest. She was no innocent bystander. She had been at the heart of it while Hermann Gring stood trial at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Emmy was interned and later placed under house arrest. She received a 5-year sentence in a denazification court in 1948, classified as a major offender. Her assets were confiscated, including her priceless art collection, which included pieces taken from Jewish families. But even after her release, Emmy remained defiant. She never renounced the Nazi ideology. She blamed Hitler's enemies for Germany's collapse and saw her husband as a visionary, not a criminal. He was a man of honor, she said once in a rare interview, who loved his country too much. Life after the war was bitter. Emmy and Edda lived in poverty in Munich, relying on family, friends, and small pensions. The luxurious life was gone, replaced by rationed bread and second-hand clothes. Emmy was banned from performing or appearing publicly for years. Her daughter Edda faced scorn in school. Her surname, a stain she could never wash off. In public, Emmy maintained her poise, but privately, she was known to be cold, arrogant, and unwilling to accept that her past was not glorious but horrifying. Her home became a shrine to the Third Reich. Portraits of Hermann lined the walls. She told neighbors stories of the good old days with Nazi elites, as if they were fairy tales and not the prelude to genocide. By the 1960s, she was largely forgotten, a relic of a cursed empire. She wrote memoirs filled with denial, half-truths, and nostalgia. She passed away in 1973, unrepentant and unchanged, still calling herself Mrs. Reichsmarschall long after the world had buried that title. Emmy Gring's story isn't just one of luxury turned to ruin, it's a warning about what happens when power blinds people to horror. She lived in a palace while others were burned in camps, and even when the truth stared her in the face, she chose memory over morality, myth over guilt. In the world of Nazi brutality, few names stirred as much fear as Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. But behind this man stood a woman who, even after his assassination, never turned her back on his legacy. Lena Heydrich, born Lena Matilda von Osen in 1911, she married Reinhard Heydrich in 1931. When he was just beginning his rise in the SS, she was a fervent nationalist and an early supporter of Hitler. In fact, Lena pushed Reinhard into joining the SS after he had been dismissed from the Navy for misconduct. She wasn't a passive wife, she was the driving force behind one of the regime's most lethal figures. Their marriage produced 4 children, and for a time their life seemed perfect. Lena lived in a villa near Prague during her husband's posting as the Deputy Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, where Reinhard imposed terror on the Czech population. It was there, in May 1942, that his car was attacked by Czech resistance fighters trained by the British. He died days later from his injuries. Nazi Germany responded to his death with horrifying vengeance, destroying the village of Lidis, murdering over 1,300 civilians, and executing countless others. Lena, meanwhile, was declared a national widow, showered with honors and pensions. She was seen by many as a tragic figure, but Lena was anything but. After the war ended, she went underground for a time. Like many wives of top Nazis, she feared capture, interrogation, and retaliation. In 1945, her villa in Czechoslovakia was seized. She fled to West Germany with her children, using forged documents and relying on the SS network still operating in secret. What makes Lena Heydrich's story uniquely disturbing is not just her proximity to evil, but her post-war audacity. She openly defended Reinhard, calling the accusations against him Allied lies. In the 1950s, she gave interviews, wrote memoirs, and even sued publishers for describing her husband as the architect of genocide. She insisted he had no knowledge of the final solution, despite overwhelming evidence that he chaired the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where the extermination of Jews was officially coordinated. In her writings, Lena painted Reinhard as a misunderstood genius, a patriot betrayed by history. She blamed the Czech people for his death and never once acknowledged the terror he orchestrated. Even into old age, she spoke proudly of his SS career, his loyalty to Hitler, and his tough but fair methods. She ran a guest house in Femmer in Germany, where she welcomed travelers, many unaware they were being served by the widow of one of history's greatest monsters. Neighbors reported that she sometimes held private dinners where old SS men would quietly gather, reminiscing about their lost glory. Lena died in 1985, never tried, never imprisoned, and never apologizing. To her last breath, she upheld the legacy of a man responsible for the murder of millions. Lena Heydrich's story is perhaps the darkest among the Nazi wives, not just because of her husband's crimes, but because she actively worked to protect his name. She lived freely while her husband's victims were buried in mass graves across Europe. Her story isn't just a window into denial, it's a portrait of a woman who embraced evil and wore it like a badge of honor. Not every wife of a top Nazi lived throughout her days in defiant luxury or public disgrace. Some disappeared quietly, others reinvented themselves under false names. But each carried the weight of a legacy soaked in blood. Part 6 shines a light on these lesser-known yet deeply complicit women, names not as famous as Magda or Emmy, but tied tightly to the machinery of the Third Reich. Marguerite Himmler, the wife of Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS and the architect of the Holocaust, was a stern, cold woman even before the war. Born in 1893, she was a nurse and a nationalist, deeply devoted to traditional values. She married Heinrich in 1928, and they had one daughter, Gudrun, while Heinrich rose through the Nazi ranks. becoming one of Hitler's most feared men. Marguerite remained in the background but never far from the ideology. She ran Nazi welfare programs for women, was active in the Red Cross, and even referred to Jews in letters with anti-Semitic contempt. Her letters to Heinrich are laced with subtle approval of his work, though she never spoke directly about the camps. After Heinrich's betrayal of Hitler and subsequent capture by the Allies in May 1945, where he bit into a cyanide capsule, Marguerite was arrested and interrogated, but like so many, she insisted she knew nothing. She was held in internment camps until 1948, then quietly released, classified as a follower rather than an active criminal in denazification courts. She lived the rest of her life in obscurity in southern Germany. She died in 1967, never tried, never punished. Her daughter Gudrun, however, became a vocal defender of her father. She helped form Stillhilfe, a secretive support network for SS war criminals, providing them with financial and legal aid. In many ways, the legacy of Marguerite lived on not in public statements, but in silence and unwavering loyalty. Then there was Gerda Bormann, wife of Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in the Reich. Gerda was not a quiet spouse. She was fanatically anti-Semitic and believed in the racial purity agenda more than even some SS wives. Her marriage was intense, but strained. Martin was cold, often absent, and deeply involved in internal Nazi politics. After the fall of Berlin in May 1945, Martin Bormann attempted to flee but likely died near the Lehrte Bahnhof station. His body wasn't discovered until 1972, but Gerda died long before that, in 1946, from cancer while living under a false name in the Bavarian Alps. Gerda left behind 9 children, many of whom were placed in Catholic orphanages. Their surname Bormann was a burden they carried in silence for decades. Some changed their names, others lived in shame, and a few tried to understand how their mother could have believed in such horror so deeply. Other Nazi wives like Anneliese von Ribbentrop, wife of Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Charlotte Speer, wife of architect Albert Speer, followed different paths. Anneliese remained deeply loyal and unrepentant until her death, calling the Nuremberg trials a disgrace. Charlotte, on the other hand, quietly supported her husband during his imprisonment, though Albert Speer became one of the few Nazi officials to publicly express guilt. These women represent a spectrum: deniers, victims of delusion, enablers, and in some cases active participants. The Allied forces prosecuted very few of them. Most were categorized as supporters or housewives. Their wealth was often seized, but their freedom was largely untouched. While their husbands swung from gallows or rotted in prison, these women lived out their days in anonymity or mild disgrace. They changed names, altered appearances, or fled to small towns, but the past lingered like a shadow. Whispers followed them in shops, their children were taunted in schools, and neighbors wondered what they knew, what they had seen, what they had allowed. As the dust of war settled over Europe in 1945, the Allied powers faced a monumental question: how do you bring justice to the architects of such unfathomable evil? The answer, at least initially, was the Nuremberg trials, where the top Nazi men were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. But what about the women, the wives who stood beside them, toasted their victories, raised their children in castles built on blood? Part 7 examines how justice failed to fully reach the women of the Third Reich, and why so many escaped meaningful accountability. At the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg 1945-1946, only men sat in the defendant's box. Not a single woman was prosecuted, despite many having held influential positions or having intimate knowledge of their husbands' atrocities. Some, like Magda Goebbels and Gerda Bormann, were already dead, but many others were alive, available, and clearly complicit. The Allies initially detained hundreds of Nazi women wives, secretaries, female guards, but most were soon classified under a denazification process. These tribunals, conducted primarily by US and British officials, divided civilians into categories: major offenders, activists, followers, and exonerated. And here's where the failures began. Most Nazi wives were labeled followers, a category intended for people who went along with the regime without direct involvement. It was a legal loophole big enough to walk a war criminal through. The logic was that these women, though married to powerful figures, were not in positions of command and thus less culpable. Ilse Hepps, for example, was detained and interrogated, but ultimately faced no trial. Her writings defending Hitler and her husband's actions were seen as ideological, not criminal. Emmy Gring received a 5-year sentence in a denazification court, but served far less time and was free by the early 1950s. Marguerite Himmler walked away without a conviction. Even more shockingly, some women were paid pensions by the new German state as war widows. They received financial support despite the fact that their husbands had orchestrated genocide. The logic: they were not found guilty in court and the burden of proof was placed impossibly high. This failure of justice wasn't just legal, it was cultural. Post-war Germany, desperate to rebuild, quickly turned its attention to economic recovery. Trials faded, public interest moved on, and in this atmosphere, many former Nazi wives reinvented themselves. They used false identities, moved to rural areas, or married again under new names. Some even got involved in far-right underground networks like Still Hilf, which provided support to former SS members and war criminals. Wives like Lena Heydrich and Gudrun Himmler, Marguerite's daughter, played a direct role in these efforts, ensuring that Nazi ideology remained alive in the shadows. Why were these women never truly punished? Gender stereotypes played a major role. Investigators often saw women as emotional, passive, or manipulated, despite clear evidence that many were ideologically committed. Lack of political will. Prosecuting hundreds of women would have strained resources and public support in post-war Europe. Societal denial. Many Germans wanted to believe that only a handful of men were guilty, not entire families, not mothers. And yet, behind closed doors, the truth was different. Letters, diaries, and testimonies revealed women who cheered deportations, benefited from stolen Jewish property, and taught their children racial hatred. They were not victims of the regime, they were its backbone in the home. The post-war justice. The system gave them a pass, but history has not. By the time the 1980s arrived, most of the Nazi wives had either died or faded into quiet anonymity. But their children were still very much alive, growing up in post-war Germany, Austria, or Argentina, carrying names that were not just infamous, but radioactive. Part 8 is the closing chapter, the legacy these women left behind and the toll it took on their sons, daughters, and the conscience of a divided world. The children of Nazi leaders bore a unique burden. Some grew up in orphanages, others were raised by a single surviving parent. All were haunted by questions their mothers rarely answered. Did you know? Why didn't you stop him? Do you feel guilty? For many, the answers never came. Gudrun Himmler, daughter of Heinrich and Marguerite Himmler, never renounced her father, even into her 80s. She referred to him affectionately as Papi and worked actively to support former SS officers through organizations like Still Hilf. Her loyalty to her parents was unwavering, fueled in large part by her mother's refusal to admit any wrongdoing. Wolf Rudiger Hess, son of Ilse and Rudolf Hess, spent decades trying to rehabilitate his father's image. He wrote books, gave interviews, and even suggested that Rudolf was murdered in Spandau prison in 1987. Officially, he committed suicide at age 93. Wolf believed deeply in his parents' innocence inheritance, not of facts, but of denial, passed from mother to son, but not all followed that path. Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, Hitler's personal lawyer and Governor General of occupied Poland, became one of Germany's most vocal critics of the Nazi legacy. His mother, Brigitte Frank, lived a long life after the war, refusing to accept her husband's crimes, but Nicholas grew up disgusted by her silence and romanticism of the Reich. He wrote brutal memoirs denouncing his father as a slaughterer, and his mother as a coward who loved luxury more than truth. The psychological impact on these children was profound. Many suffered from depression, identity crises, and social isolation. Schools bullied them, employers turned them away. And yet others were drawn into neo-Nazi circles, radicalized by the same ideologies their mothers had refused to disown. Historians and psychologists began to call this generational trauma the burden of blood. It wasn't just guilt by association, it was an inheritance of silence. Mothers like Lena Heydrich, Emmy Gring, and Marguerite Himmler didn't sit their children down and confess. They didn't warn them against hatred. They passed on myth, martyrdom, and martyr complexes. Society, too, played a role in this cycle. Post-war Germany was eager to move on, to erase the stain of its past with economic miracles and European alliances. The children of the Reichsmonsters were often left to grapple with horrors alone, torn between love for their parents and disgust at what they stood for. The Nazi wives died with different fates: Magda in the bunker, Lena in obscurity, Emmy unrepentant, Ilse delusional, but none ever truly stood trial, not just in court, but in the eyes of the families they destroyed, the lives they touched, and the children they raised in a house built on genocide. And so their legacy lingers not just in archives or books, but in whispered conversations, forgotten tombstones, and sons and daughters who still ask, "Who were you, really, when the world was burning?" This is what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II. They were not forgotten. They were not forgiven. They were left behind.